Welcome back to Counting the Cost. I'm Imran Garda. Japan has just elected a new government. Let's go to Wayne Hay in Kuala Lumpur to see what that spells for Asia's largest economy.
Japan's economic woes will be at the top of the agenda when its new government takes office later this month. In the recent general election, the Democratic Party of Japan secured a landslide victory over the powerful Liberal Democratic Party, which had been in power for 53 of the past 54 years. The political shake-up couldn't come at a more important time for Japan, for in the year since the global financial crisis struck, the world's second largest economy shrank at a pace comparable only to the days of the oil crisis in the 1970s. Japan's economy returned to growth in the April-June quarter of this year, expanding by just under 1%. Economists say short-term stimulus efforts have helped, but the economy is likely to contract once again later this year. The billions of tax dollars pumped in to shore up the economy have left a mammoth public debt equivalent to 170% of GDP, the highest among advanced nations. Unemployment has risen to 5.7%. That's 1 million more unemployed this year than in 2008, and the highest it's been since World War II. Also, the Japanese aren't buying like they used to. Consumer prices falling by 2.2% in July from a year earlier, the fastest pace on record. Japan's a nation traditionally reliant on selling its goods abroad, but exports to the US and China, the two biggest buyers of Japanese goods, have been in free fall. Well, this all amounts to a huge challenge for the newly elected leader Yukio Hatoyama. So how will he cope? Steve Chow in Tokyo has more.
We're here in Akihabara, one of the famous electronics districts in downtown Tokyo. It is in places like this the DPJ is looking for a solution to the country's economic problems. Before the election, the DPJ was campaigning on promises of putting cash incentives directly into the hands of consumers so they can boost consumer spending. This is only a small part of the solution for the country's economic problems. Yukio Hatoyama, the head of the DPJ, recognizes how mammoth the task is in terms of pulling this country out of economic crisis. In the next few days, we can expect Hatoyama to talk about creating a new ministry specifically to deal with the economy. The task is mammoth, as you mentioned earlier. Here are some statistics. The government here is only now slowly trying to pull this country out of the deepest recession since World War II. Unemployment stands at 5.7%. We're talking about 3.5 million people in this country unemployed. At the same time, the long-term issues, an aging workforce, and a growing mushrooming debt getting close to 200% of the GDP. Now, in the next few months, by the end of this year, Hatoyama is expected to put together a national budget for 2010. It will come at a crucial time. That is when a lot of the stimulus packages put together by his predecessor Taro Aso will begin to lose steam. Will this new government have to spend more? Where will they find the money? Hatoyama has pledged to find a lot more money by cutting government waste, by taking on the bureaucracy, cutting a lot of the traditional ties with industry that has been blamed largely for the government waste. Can it in fact do that? Can it do what is equivalent to an economic revolution in this country? Many people are skeptical in terms of the politics involved, in terms of the big task at hand. We'll see how Hatoyama and the Democratic Party of Japan do. Steve Chow, Al Jazeera, Tokyo.
All right, joining me now to get some more insight into the prospects for Japan's economy under its new government is Steve Keen. He's the Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Western Sydney and also the author of Debunking Economics. Steve, thanks for joining us. Japan officially out of recession, but the economy remains in a pretty bad state. Why?
Well, because they've never addressed the problems they acquired in the first instance from the bursting of their bubble economy back in the 1980s. Back in 1990, when that crash began, the Western governments were deriding the Japanese and saying, oh, it's all because Japan has an opaque financial system. That couldn't happen in the West, and they're keeping alive zombie banks and trying to stimulate their way out of trouble. Well, that's true. Japan tried that for 15 to 20 years, and it's got them nowhere. And guess what? The West is now in exactly the same situation. So we now have a global zombie financial system, and failing to address that is why Japan is still stuck where it is. If the West fails to address it, the Japan will have company.
We saw that the government stimulus packages offered by the outgoing regime did in fact lift Japan out of recession, but they're short-term fixes. So what are you expecting from the new incoming government?
Well, I hope a realisation ultimately they've got to confront the real elephant in the living room, and the usual story is people focused on Japan's government debt, which of course is virtually quadrupled compared to its GDP over the last 20 years, trying to fight this with a series of basically failed stimulus packages. While they've ignored the private debt levels, then the private sector's paid its debt down to some degree, but the financial system is still carrying just as much debt as it was back in 1990, and overall Japan's debt level's risen, even though the private sector's reduced its own debt slightly. They really have to attack the private debt levels. We had a dysfunctional financial system that caused the trouble. We have to finally admit it, and I think the only way out of this ultimately is what might be called a modern 21st century jubilee. Start abolishing the debt, write off the financial system and start all over again, because it's the private financial system that caused the crisis, and by avoiding taking action against them, Japan has had 20 years of lost economic performance.
So Steve, in comparison to other industrialised nations, how is Japan faring?
Japan is, one thing, the great benefit of Japan was it wasn't just a centre for financial speculation. Of course, it's been the most successful industrialisation story in human history, and that is still there, even though the financial system almost destroyed that capacity during the 1990s with the bubble economy. So Japan's got that strength. It also is totally, its debt is entirely owed to itself. It doesn't have to worry about international debt repayment problems as the Americans might have to at some stage. So Japan has got much more chance to be free and strike out differently than the rest of the world has, and I certainly hope Japan takes that option.
So economically then, let's look into the crystal ball. What is the future for Japan? Is it likely to slip back into recession before making a full sustainable recovery?
Yes, if they don't address the levels of private debt. If they leave private debt where it is, then the debt servicing charge that imposes upon the rest of the economy is so great that money which should be going towards investment instead goes towards debt servicing and slows down the rebuilding and the boosting of that industrial strength of Japan once more, and give you that slow set into the sunset. I mean, really it's gone from the rising sun to the setting sun, courtesy of not addressing what the financial sector did to Japan in the 1980s. So if they do the same old things, stimulus packages, trying to boost the government-supplied money supply by small amounts compared to the level of private debt, they'll fall back into the quagmire once more, and this time they haven't got exports to the rest of the world to rescue them. The only way really, I think, is to bite the bullet and to address those private debt levels by literally abolishing it, taking over the private financial sector and reorganising it, not letting this level of speculation ever take place again. But I'm afraid one of the definitions of madness is doing the same thing time and time again and expecting a different result. And my fear is the new government will display its same madness and not address the real cause of the problem, which is that private debt that has never been reduced from the 1990s.
All right, Steve Keane from the University of Western Sydney, thanks for joining us.
It's 4 decades since Libya's Colonel Gaddafi came to power in a bloodless coup. And with the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, the formerly socialist state is prospering. Let's take a look now at Libya's economy. The oil sector accounts for 1/4 of Libya's economy, and 95% of revenue comes from the export of oil. The non-oil manufacturing and construction sector accounts for 20% of gross domestic product. Based on GDP, the country is ranked 57th out of 179 nations by the International Monetary Fund, which values the economy at $100 billion. Well, since sanctions were lifted in 2003, Libya has negotiated several high-profile international investment contracts. In 2007, Libya agreed to buy British missiles and air defense systems, and oil giant British Petroleum won rights to explore for oil. BP joins a handful of US oil companies, Amerada Hess, ExxonMobil, Chevron and Occidental, that have signed deals with Tripoli. France signed a deal to supply nuclear technology with Libya, agreeing to buy its Airbus planes. And last year, Russia cancelled $4.5 billion of Libyan debts in exchange for several contracts, including upgrading Libyan railways. Ahmed Al-Kaki visited the Libyan capital, Tripoli, to see how international investment is changing the face of this once isolated state.
Nadim Baba is a Tunisian entrepreneur who's developing multiple construction projects in Libya, including this luxury hotel he's building for the government. He says new investment laws are opening Libya up to the world.
There are many opportunities for private investment here. Its contribution will become clearer in 4 to 5 years after the projects are done. The infrastructure is developing. There are new hotels and convention centers.
Construction sites like this one are dotting the Libyan capital Tripoli. Before the early years of this decade, such large-scale investments were unheard of in this tightly controlled social welfare state. Here in downtown Tripoli, a multinational chain is building a 351-room hotel for business travelers. And on the coastal highway, the Koreans made a similar deal. It's quite a leap for a country that was modeled by its 40-year leader Muammar Gaddafi on a brand of socialism. After years of isolation, the government has moved toward liberalizing the economy, particularly since UN sanctions were lifted in 2003. The country is already Africa's second wealthiest country, thanks to oil and gas, which make up 95% of its revenues. Libya has already awarded exploration licenses to Western companies. But as the country slowly opens up, questions loom over the viability of its policies.
When you compare Libya with similar oil-based economies like the Arab Gulf states, who also have similar very small populations, you find that those Arab Gulf states have used these resources very much to build infrastructure, to have a varied economy, for prosperity, and the average citizen has enjoyed huge levels of prosperity. In comparison, Libyan economy is being very weak.
Another issue is the fact that Libya has become known for demanding political concessions in return for business deals, a tactic pursued successfully for years. But officials here stand by the way they do business, stressing they don't really need capital. What they are after is technical and management expertise.
Investors who are after a fast return won't find that here. We prefer investments through long-term relations, based on mutual interest. What Libya wants is cooperation based on partnerships with large companies, in a way that's not just about implementing contracts, but rather consistency and sustainability.
Slim, for one, is certain Libya's economy is on the right track. A track he believes will attract more investors, but ones who understand the need to run their business from within the country, not remotely. Amr Kahki, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Well, a reminder that you can keep up to date with these and other stories on our website, aljazeera.net/English. Click on the left-hand side for the business page. Well, that's it from me, Imran Garda, this week. Thanks for watching Counting the Cost.